Patterns can feel like a foreign language. There are all these funny symbols and terms and abbreviations that you've never seen and heard of. So before we learn how to create patterns, let's understand how to draw them. Hi, welcome to Pattern Making with Lee. If you plan on creating patterns in the industry, you need to learn how to draw them. Even if you want to work in production and development, you still need to learn how to read patterns, so this video is important for you too. And I'll be going through all the common symbols and abbreviation terms that you need to know. Plus I'll share lots of industry tips on how to optimize your pattern drawing and create really great patterns, so watch out for those too.
This is the pattern outline of a basic fitted dress with a back, front and sleeve. You can see along the edge there are these short perpendicular lines. These are called notches. Notches are used to match pattern pieces together when you sew them. Each seam should have at least one notch. Single notches are used for the front and double notches are used on the back. That's how you can easily tell the front and back on a sleeve. Another thing you need to sew pattern pieces together is seam allowances.
Seam allowances are usually 1 centimeter, so 3/8 of an inch for most finishes. There are some exceptions though.
This is a shirt pattern, and when a pattern piece is small, like the vent band or a placket, I often do a 6mm, so 1/4 inch seam allowance.
If you've ever sewn a shirt, you know these pieces are really fiddly and hard to sew, so having a smaller seam allowance makes it much easier. Now for a high-end design tip. If you're creating a really fitted sample for the runway or for a private client, it's good to have 2 centimeters, so 3/4 inch seam allowances. This gives you more room to fit a sample to specific measurements of a runway model. Or if you're making it for a private client, spend a lot of money on dress and want to be able to adjust it if they change sizes.
Common places for larger seam allowances are the shoulder, side seam, and centre back seam, if you have one. You can see that the notches along the pattern outline have been copied to the seam allowance too. Plus, there are notches marking the corners of the seam allowances.
Commercial sewing pattern notches are often triangles and tell you to cut a wedge out. This is not what we do in the industry. You just cut a small snip at each of the notches and it should be about half the seam allowance width. Any smaller and it's too hard to find, any bigger and you risk cutting a hole in your fabric.
If the pattern doesn't have a seam allowance along an edge, it will usually have this symbol, which means cut on the fold. When you see this symbol, you need to fold your fabric, place the edge with the symbol on the fold, and cut the piece. This creates a mirror image of the pattern. You'll also need to add a hem allowance along the hem. This can be anywhere between 1 centimeter to 4 centimeters, so 3/8 of an inch to 1.5 inches.
Your finish and hem width will depend on your fabric and the shape of your hem. And each of my clicked pattern kit guides has a find your finishes chart to help you select the best one. Oh, another tip, I'd recommend writing all your finishes for the seam and hem and any sewing instructions directly on the pattern. Put them on the spec sheet too, but often spec sheets don't get read.
This is a fitted dress, and when something is fitted to the body, it will usually have darts, which are triangular wedges used to sculpt the pattern to the body. Sometimes they're within a pattern piece, like these waist darts. Other times, they're at the edge, like this bust and neck dart. All darts have dart legs that finish at the dart point. The seamstress will sew along these dart legs and finish at the dart point. This essentially removes that section of the pattern.
However, as patterns becomes looser and more oversized, you don't need darts because you're not trying to sculpt around the bust and the backside.
Notice how there aren't any darts on the oversized shirt pattern? A drill hole is a small cross with a circle around it. They are used to mark points within a pattern piece, like dart points. You may also see drill holes along the dart legs when they're long or curved. Having a series of points will help you sew the dart correctly.
There are lots of ways to mark drill holes on your fabric. I use purple vanishing marker, which is what we did at Jane Packham and Alexander McQueen, but you can use chalk or thread, up to you. Another way to sculpt the pattern around the body is to ease and stretch the pattern edges. Edges that are eased are actually gathered together slightly. You shouldn't actually see the gathers, but the edge will get smaller.
The top of most fitted sleeves is eased into the armhole. This allows the sleeve to sculpt over the top of the arm. And all you need to do is draw an arrowed line along the section and write ease next to it. You can also write the amount that needs to be eased too. Stretch
is the opposite. So these sections of the pattern will actually be pulled when you sew them. This is very common for parts of the pattern that are on the bias, because obviously bias fabric stretches, so these sections of the seams need to be made smaller.
To mark a stretch section, draw an arrowed line along the section and write stretch next to it. Once again, you can write the amount you need to stretch to.
I know I'm covering a lot in this video, so if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, I have written a 10-step pattern checklist that I use to check my patterns before I send them to production.
To get a copy, head to my website, clickedpatternkits.com, subscribe to my newsletter, and I'll email you a copy.
I'll also include a little cheat sheet at the end of this video for you to screenshot too.
One of the most important markings on your pattern is the grain line. This determines the way the pattern will be cut. A grain line is a straight line with 2 arrows on it.
The arrows can be at the end or somewhere along the line. When you cut the pattern in fabric, the arrow should run parallel to the fabric edge, which is known as the selvage. If the arrows point in opposite directions, this means you can place the pattern running up or down the fabric. It doesn't matter. However, if the arrows are pointing in the same direction, all the patterns need to point in the same direction. I always have my arrows going in the same direction. It's a good habit to get into because the fabric can always have a slight sheen or a little difference that you don't realise when you're cutting, then you make the final sample and you realise later on, and it's such a shame. It's also important to mark key guidelines, such as centre front, which is shortened to CF, centre back, CB, bust, waist and hip, as well as the centre, bicep and elbow lines on the sleeve. You can write the names next to them too. It's a really good idea for two reasons. Firstly, always measure along the centre front, centre back, bust, waist and hip when you do measurements for spec sheets. Secondly, knowing where these points are makes it easy to adapt patterns and also using reference points to add design details like pockets. And you can see I've got notches at the end of all these lines too. You have to have notches somewhere along the seam, and it's a good idea to get the practice of putting them at these points so you know where they are on the pattern. To draw a zip, mark where it will start and end with a notch. Then, draw an arrowed line along the section and write zip next to it. Buttons are marked with a cross surrounded by a dashed line circle, about the same size as the button. The buttonhole is a straight line with two short perpendicular lines at each end. On this shirt pattern, you can see these arrowed lines with fold written next to them. You can write pleat or fold, up to you, but the arrow should point to where the folded edge of the fabric is being folded to. This fold is being used to create a box pleat, so I've written box pleat next to it. It's always nice to include sewing instructions. To mark gathering, draw a notch at the start and end of the gathered section. Then, draw a squiggly arrowed line along the section and write gather to X centimetres or inches. X is the finished length, so what length the section should be gathered to. Any top stitching, whether it is to attach a design detail like a pocket and pocket flap, visible stitching for a front button placket, or edge stitching next to a seam, it needs to be marked with a dashed line, which kind of looks like stitching. If you look at the pocket, you'll notice the drill holes are placed at each corner so the pattern can be placed correctly. And there are some sewing instructions. Pocket placement left hand side only, which means the pocket is to be placed here on the left hand side only. A pattern piece can be either block fused, so fused all over the pattern piece, or in patches. If the pattern is patch fused, like the placket on this shirt, you'll see diagonal lines over the area that needs to be fused, and the word fuse written in between them. Before we move on to pattern labels, here's a little cheat sheet of some of the common pattern making symbols you'll see on industry patterns. One of the most important parts of a pattern is its label, and because it's so important, it's a good idea to put it in the centre of the pattern, near the grain line and in big writing, so it's easy to find. And the label should be made of 5 components. At the top will be the pattern piece name, which should describe what it is and where it is on the body. If it's a lining, facing or binding pattern, remember to include that too. The more complex your pattern is, the more precise and detailed your name will need to be. And there is a bit of an art to naming patterns, and I've done a whole page on it in my guides. There are a couple of abbreviations you need to be aware of too. RHS, right hand side, LHS, left hand side. These are used to name patterns on different sides of the body, so if your design was asymmetric, you may have a front right hand side and a front left hand side piece. Under the name is the cutting instructions, which tells you how and how many to cut. If it says cut 1, cut 1. If it says cut 2, cut 2. But sometimes patterns will say cut 1 pair. PR is abbreviation for pair, which usually means you're using the same pattern piece for the right and left side, like a sleeve. So you need to cut 2 of it, but it's actually a mirror of the pattern piece, otherwise you have 2 right sleeves. You can cut a pair by folding the fabric in half and cutting both at the same time, or cut 1, then flip the pattern to cut the other. See how you have 2, but they're a mirror of each other? Then the label will tell you what fabric to cut it in. This would be a generic term, not the actual fabric composition, like silk or organza. The main terms are self, lining, fuse, and contrast. Self is the main fabric used on the body of the garment. All patterns have self fabric. Lining refers to any fabric used to line the garment. If your self fabric is see-through or itchy, you might want to line the inside with the fabric to make it more comfortable. Then there's fuse, which is used to strengthen self or lining fabric. When we say fuse, we usually mean an adhesive fabric which has little glue dots on one side that's then ironed onto the self fabric or lining to make it stronger. This is very common on collars and cuffs. Last but not least, contrast is any secondary fabric using on the outer body of the garment. A good example would be a shirt where the patch pocket is cut in a different fabric. Before we move on, these terms often have colours associated with them. At fashion school, they'll tell you to write each of those cutting instructions in the correct colour, but most patterns are done digitally now, but it always helps, and I always do this when I have a pattern in-house. I'll get a coloured marker and mark the correct colour next to it. This makes it really easier for whoever's cutting the fabric to read it correctly and cut the sample correctly.
There are two other abbreviations you need to be aware of on cutting instructions. RSU, right side up, which means cutting the pattern right side up so the markings are visible, and WSU, wrong side up, which means flipping the pattern when you cut it so the markings aren't visible.
These are often used when the pattern is asymmetric and you need to cut one of them.
As an example, you'd write cut oneself right side up. Then, if you're using the same piece as lining, you could write cut one lining wrong side up. Under the cutting instructions, it's a good idea to put the pattern piece number and how many there are.
This just really helps you keep track of the pieces in a busy studio.
Then, put the pattern size. Usually, this will be the studio sample size, unless you're working on a graded set or a custom order. Underneath that is the style number for that season. Common abbreviations are DR dress, T for tops and shirts, TR for trousers, pants or shorts, J for jackets and coats.
And we're done! Well, I'm sticking with it. That was a long but really important video. Now let's move on to module 2 of my introductory pattern making course. We'll start getting the skills to create your own patterns.